Hey everyone, Jeff Woods here, Vice President of The One Thing. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's One Thing webinar series. Every month, we bring on an author whose content we really admire, that we think is aligned with the principles of The One Thing. And the person that you are going to meet today is no exception to that. Before we dive in, I want to do a quick audio video check. Please let me know if you can see/hear us by putting yes in the questions box, or put where you're joining us from. So Cody says yes. Graham, great to see you again, my friend. Thank you for being here. Autumn, thank you. Cody's in Austin. That's right. Sherry's in Austin. I got Ann, Chris in Portland, Atlanta. Awesome. Hey, Lynn, great to see you. Lynn, love the picture of your One Thing planner. I saw that today, so very nice job there. Shannon in Memphis. Excellent. Okay, let's kick this bad boy off. For those of you who are not familiar with the ideas of the One Thing and you're going, well, what is the One Thing? It's the surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. And at the heart of it is this idea that you and I, we wake up with the same number of hours each day, yet why is it that some people end up achieving extraordinary results, and then you've got these other people that just, it's okay, it's okay. It's the idea that there are, everything that you can do can be divided into two groups: your most important work and everything else, true priorities and everything else. And in the focus of today's conversation for the One Thing webinar series is going to be around sales, getting the sales edge, and really understanding what it is that your customers truly want. Now, how many of you who are watching this are in a sales capacity? If so, put yes in the questions box, and if no, go ahead and do a little question mark. That way we can see live. Okay, Autumn is a yes. Chris is a yes. Melissa, yes, yes. Real estate, okay, excellent. Ann says we're all in sales. Correct, Ann, correct. Excellent. Well, one of the things that we really value is we don't just want to put anybody in front of you. We want to put people in front of you that they're believable, that they're credible, they have a track record, and they're someone you should pay attention to. And the person that you're looking to with the very stylish glasses is someone who's played a big role in my life. So for those of you who know, before I partnered with Gary Keller and Jay Papazan to start this company behind the One Thing, I was in medical device sales. And at one point in time, after a colleague of mine suffered a stroke at 35, and me realizing, wow, I have to wake up and trade hours for dollars, and my wife's a stay-at-home mom, what happens to my wife and my baby girl if something happens to me? And the next week I suffer or my company changes my commission structure and I suffer a 40% pay cut. So those two things made me realize that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I needed to start surrounding myself with people who were where I wanted to be. I attended an event, and I remember the guy who was leading it said, you know, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And most of you don't even realize that there is someone who is sitting in this room right now who is someone that you should know. And then he pointed to Gene McNaughton right here. Gene has had a very, trying to think of the right word, a very interesting career. He worked with Gateway Computers way back when it was just a company in a little barn, and played a pivotal role from that company going from itty bitty company to $11 billion. He then left and was the executive vice president of sales for Tony Robbins. He was Tony's right-hand man, helped build Tony's company. He was one of the first people that Tony trusted him to step on the stage in Tony's absence. He then left and worked with Chet Holmes, who wrote The Ultimate Sales Machine. So you start to look at the track record. This is not some guy who has just written another sales book. This is a guy who has done it and is very believable. And so today we're going to be really diving deep into what are the 20% activities that you can be doing so that you get that sales edge. Now, for those of you who are here live for the training, the book's coming. When does the book actually come out?
The book launches on July 16th, next Monday.
Okay, cool. So for those of you, you can time block that. For those of you who are listening to this later on the One Thing podcast, it is out there, and you can get it on Amazon, or is it the salesedge.co?
Yeah, the salesedge.co will get you a free chapter right away. So if you want to go there, and then you'll get a special announcement when the book launches, as well as I'm sure Jeff will be sending an email out. The first week, it's going to be like at rock bottom prices because we want to drive it to #1. So that's going to be the time to get it. So next Monday through next Friday.
Awesome. So Gene, let's go back. We're gonna take everybody. I kind of gave them the arc of your career before you led to what you do today. Why don't we go back to your first sales job? I know that you sold shoes. I sold women's shoes at Nordstrom because my wife said that would be wonderful marriage training because if you can deal with bunions, you can deal with anything. But you were like you're older, so you're like Al Bundy, right?
Now that you put it that way, and by the way, that's right when that show got going. So you're not the first to use the joke on me. But yeah, so you go through selling newspapers as a kid. I worked at a place called the Athlete's Foot here in Sioux City, Iowa, which is where I'm at right now. And that was pure retail. But when I got moved into the sales job, or I took the sales job selling shoes, we were selling high-end shoes. And as you know, in any mall, regardless of where you are, there's anywhere from 8 to 28 different places you can buy shoes. In those days, from Payless to Sears and J.C. Penney's. And then we had this higher end shoe company selling shoes like Allen Edmond and Tony Lama boots. And never before that had somebody sat down and said, let me show you, some things that you can use, some techniques that you can deploy that will help people to say yes to buying the shoes you're selling, or it was just the shoes in those cases. And the very first time somebody actually said, here's what you do, Gene. The guy's name was Rudolph Pape. The name of the store is called Rudolph Shoes. If you've ever been here, you know who I'm talking about. And he said, Gene, there's only 3 things you need to know in the shoe business. First, you gotta greet them. So when people come near our store or in our store, you've got to have a polite and professional greeting. Secondly, when they come in the store, you got to meet them. So he said, go up and introduce yourself, ask them what they're in for, what they're trying to do. And then the third thing is he said, you got to seat them. And he said, once you get them in the chair and you get the shoes on their feet, 75% of them will say yes. And then we got a little bit of product training. Like, we had to be able to distinguish what the difference of in those days, a $300 shoe like an Allen Edmond was versus a shoe that might have looked like that was $80. You could get it Payless. And we learned about the cork sole. We learned about how it was cut, how it was built, the leather that was used, how it would be impacted. A cheap shoe would be impacted when you're walking in snow and slush. I am from Iowa, by the way. When you're walking in snow and slush with a cheap shoe versus a better shoe that's going to last longer. But I reflect back on that because that was the first time that I just thought I was okay at sales because I was comfortable talking to people, and I'd never known of a technique. I'd never learned the proper way to introduce myself or shake hands, as you don't learn that stuff in school. But yeah, so I sold shoes for 3 years, and that's really what helped put me through college and pay expenses and stuff like that. And my next role after that was to go to Gateway. And at that time, Gateway was a little company, but a lot of my friends were going there after college. I went to college here in my hometown as well. And my first pursuit was I wanted to be a stockbroker. If you remember the movie, Jeff, called Wall Street, and Gordon Gekko and Bud Fox, and that was right in my heyday, late 1980s, early 1990s. Got my Series 7 license, and I was grinding. And in those days, kind of the code word was, once you got your license and went to work for a firm, all you did was cold call for the other people. And I quickly learned that smiling and dialing was not something to smile about. It was 200-300 calls a day. And then I had all my buddies. Now I maxed out my one credit card to buy 3 suits, so you have to wear a suit when you go to that environment. And I got all my other buddies that are making 5 times the money I'm making, wearing jeans to work, selling computers. And computers were, having a computer in the house or multiple computers in an office in those days was not common. Like today, it's everywhere, but in those days it wasn't common because computers were so expensive. But one of my friends said, look, you got to come out here and check this out. And I didn't believe that he was making the money he made, and he had called on me for financial advising advice. And I said, show me your pay stub. And he sure enough did, and it was 5 times more than I was making. I'm like, I'm in the wrong place. So that's when I started at Gateway, working the night shift,
Now,
Tuesday
again,
through Saturday.
The one thing is about the surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. I think everybody who is on listening to this live or listening to this later wants to achieve more. Just average is not good enough. When you went into Gateway, your results crushed everyone else's. Talk about that a little bit and at the heart why that happened.
Well, first I got to preface this by saying my first 3 months I was terrible. So I came in, got training. So I didn't just start off and this magical thing happened. I remember sitting in my cubicle going, okay, where's my list? Who am I calling? And they said, you don't call people, they call you. And I'm like, what? That was like a phantom concept to me, that they did a lot of direct response advertising, call this 800 number. And then our job was to convince them to say yes, and say yes to us, because there was a lot of people that sold computers. But remember, my first 3 months, I was bottom of the 60 reps and wondering if I'd made the right decision. Although, I was single at the time, so I thought, okay, I'm going to work longer hours. Well, that didn't necessarily pay off. I got some level of incremental results, but coming in at 8 and leaving at 10 o'clock at night was not something that I wanted to do the rest of my life. But the biggest breakthrough I had was in about month 5, when my manager handed me my commission check, and he looked at me and he didn't say a word. He just shook his head, like, that disgust look you give somebody. And he said, you need to make some changes. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I can't do anymore. I had this closed mindset. He said, tell you what, why don't you go talk to, and in those cases, that time there was 4 people that were always at the top. And one of the guys, his name was Willie, he drove a Porsche, and I'd never in my life seen a Porsche in, Sioux City, Iowa. And I'm thinking, oh, he was just lucky. I had all these excuses, but he said, take a day off, go talk to these people and ask them if you can just listen to them. Because we were all in cubicles, yet they're making, literally 3, 4, 5 times more money than I was making. And at first I was nervous because, they were the top performers, they were the elite, and I was just a grunt that was on the bottom trying to, make a buck. And surprisingly, they all said, yes, come sit with me. I'll give you 2 hours. I'll show you what I do. But the biggest thing I did when I did that was I took really good notes. And I realized that while all of them were top performers, all of them had one special thing they did that was unique compared to the people I would hear around me that were in the bullpen is what we called it. And I kind of compiled that. Like, Willie had this great way to maintain and build rapport with both his business and his personal and his consumer clients. And a lady named Bridget, she was a top performer, but she mostly sold to the government and explained that there was, different nuances and RFPs and different things you had to do. I had another guy named Bart that was really, really meticulous at telling the story of the company and asking great questions. But once I started compiling it, and I thought, okay, I can use a little bit of Willie, a little bit of Bart, a little bit of Lane, and a little bit of Bridget. And I built kind of my methodology, and I had all these sticky notes laid out around my cubicle. It looked absolutely crazy, and probably people thought it was just a big mess. But I slowly started to hone the methodology. And in month 6, I moved up to the middle. In month 7, I was in the top 20. In month 8, I was in the top 10. In month 9, so now it's September, I was number 1 on the floor. And we could measure conversion ratios. It was the number of leads you took, divided into the number of conversions you had. And I looked at my conversion, and I was at 64%. I've still got the statistics. The average of the floor was at 30%, so I was more than double the average. And the top closer among everybody on the floor was at 42. And one of the leaders, the VPs, noticed that and said, what, because he looks at the numbers, he tracked them, and he just said, what happened? I said, well, I'm just doing this stuff on the wall. And a management job came open. I took the manager job. And so I'm 10 months into the job, and we're starting to grow pretty quick. This is 1991. And one of the things I realized, because I would take on the new hires in the night shift, but I realized that while they would come out knowing about technology, we did a pretty good job of teaching people about how a computer worked and how you build one and what a hard drive was, what a motherboard was, typical product training. But all of them would come out not knowing how to sell a computer. So I said, rather than me plugging in, trying to do that with 15 reps, I just said, okay, from now on, we're bringing our lunch on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. We were going to have lunch in-house. And then I was going to do sales training. So I started doing that. And once I started doing that, we started seeing new hire performance increase radically. Because, here's the one thing I find, Jeff, and this is true in 1991 and it's true in 2018, is that all sellers that I come across, and there's been tens of thousands, as you are a personal witness to this, when I interview them and role play with them, I find that rarely do I find a seller that follows a clear, complete system. In fact, everybody that I deal with are using tools and skills that they've just picked up along the way. Something they heard here, something they heard there, something they made up, but nothing clear and complete. First step, second step, third step. So I started teaching this program called the 7 Steps to Selling. And I took the notes off my sticky wall, typed them into a Word doc, and that was our working manual. Well, we started to see superior performance from the new hires as compared to the new hires before. In fact, in some cases, our new hires were outperforming people that were on the floor selling. They hadn't gotten this training. And I was a manager for, 4 or 5 months, and we started seeing this dynamic performance. And the VPs came to me and said, "We want you to go teach everybody how to do that." And I'm like, "I don't know how to teach. I'm not a speaker. I'm not a trainer. I'm just a sales guy that cares." They go, "Just take what you've been teaching them, put it on paper. You can go see any seminars you want." And, sometimes, Jeff, coincidence comes into our life. And like the day after they told me that, I didn't know what a seminar was. I'd never seen a seminar. I'd never heard of guys like Tom Hopkins or Zig. I had heard of Zig, but hadn't read any of his stuff. But it was like that day, random facts came in about a Zig Ziglar seminar. And I took it to the boss. He allowed me to go. And that was, if I go back to what have been some of the most pivotal moments in my career that got me to where I am today, was I attended the Zig Ziglar seminar. It was a seminar called Born to Win. And it was a 3-day intensive goal setting seminar. And it was like visualizing your life in 25 years and everything: physical, relationships, material items, attitude about your religious beliefs, all of that. It was fabulous, because I figured, one of the greatest, from being an athlete, I knew of the power of goal setting. So I learned this, and then I also learned indirectly the art of the subtle upsell and cross sell. So 2 weeks before the event, I get a phone call saying, "Hey, congratulations, you've been registered. We just had an opening come up for a seminar that starts right after the Born to Win seminar." And I said, "Okay." And I'm thinking, okay, whatever. And they say, are you a public speaker? And I said, "No." They go, "Do you do training?" I'm like, "I'm going to be." And they said, "Well, this one you've got to come to." And the seminar was titled Effective Business Presentation. It was Zig Ziglar teaching the science and art of public speaking. And I got the approval to do that, and I stayed. And probably, if I can, rank the top 10 decisions I've ever made in my career, it was saying yes. And I went. And I learned, there's one thing, a lot of people will claim, Jeff, that, "Oh, I'm a good public speaker. I feel very comfortable." I'm like, well, I watch them speak, or I ask them, "What have you studied? What have you done?" Like, "Oh, no, I'm just a natural." And I'm like, that is such bunk. Because once you learn the science, body language, facial communication, eye communication, how to work the room, how to get audience involvement, even a novice can get on a golf course and swing a club and say they're a golfer. But once you learn the real techniques, and we spent some money. In those days it was $600, $700, $800. But that is what catapulted it, because once I got done with that, I had started building out the sales training manual, and now we
Well,
had.
hold on, let me jump in there real quick, Gene, because, and I want to interact with you, the audience, because so many of you are in sales who are listening to this. How many of you are approaching, whether you have a territory or you approach your role on a daily basis, and you just do the best that you can do? You're doing it entrepreneurially, though. You're winging it. You're relying on your natural abilities. And how many of you are constantly looking for a model or a system for you to work, to tweak, to hone, and you're not relying on your natural ability? You're following the model in the system. I'm curious what the split is of the people who are here live. Put an E in the question box if you're going entrepreneurially, and put a P if you're truly committed and following a purposeful path.
Well, Jeff, nobody would want to admit that.
Well, look, I'll admit it. I was entrepreneurial up until the point where I met you, pretty much. And then, Gene, and this is the part I left out, I cornered Gene in the room that day when the guy pointed him out, and it turned out that we were about neighbors, lived about a mile from each other, and that formed a relationship. And he mentored and guided me through the entire process of when I was interviewing with Gary and Jay. And so, that was that point in my life where it moved from being more entrepreneurial to being more purposeful. So it looks like we're pretty split on the E to P. So that's awesome. Good to know.
Yeah,
so,
Jeff, and I'll add two things I want to add. One is, here was the beauty of the timing of that, or the quote unquote coincidence, was that my one thing was I wasn't just about building a training manual. It's like, I want to transform. Now we have 80, 90 sellers on the floor. I wanted to transform everybody because once the system clicked, and again, I am the first to say I did not make this up. I did put the pieces together and document it, but like I said, it was a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this, and I thought of going, okay, yep, there's levels of preparation. You've got to build rapport. You've got to ask questions. You've got to present based on the questions that you ask. You've got to be prepared to ask for the business or assume the sales. What I would always say, just assume they're buying from you. If there's an objection, there was only 4 or 5 we would get. So we identified those, and for most of you, quote unquote objections, every company I go to, when people say we get 100 objections, I'm like, name them all. And the truth is, for most of you, there's no kidding. For most of you, you get about 4 or 5 that account for 95% of all the objections you get. So price, I need to wait. I'm looking at a competitor. Can you give me some modification? Can you get it to me sooner? Can you do more for whatever it is? But there's not that many. Yet, when I go into a company as a consultant and I interview 5 sellers and I ask them the exact same questions, what do you say when this happens? And how do you prepare for a meeting? How do you run those first meetings? What kind of research do you do before you get there on the company you're meeting with or the person? And when I ask 5 people those same questions, I get 5 answers to every single question, right? So this isn't hyperbole. One of the things that Jeff said is really critical to point out. There's a lot of sales books and sales trainers out there or sales speakers out there. And, I look at many of them and I'm like, you're not in the grind. You're like a sideline reporter. Maybe they sold 20 years ago and now they write about it, but they're not in the game. They're not making the calls. They're not the ones that are moving the deals, negotiating the deals, and winning the contracts. And I'm not trying to plug the book, but that's one of the biggest messages to get out there. There are, in my days of being in the seminar world, I've seen plenty of, wealth speakers that are showing up and, that aren't wealthy. Let's put it that way. And you want to, just as you delineate what you're going to read and who you're going to listen to, make sure it's somebody that's in the game right now. And I've read so many, over 400 books. I just moved, so I meticulously know that because I had to move them. That's not fun. But I'm like, I can't throw this away. This was the book that I learned this, right? But there's so many, speakers and authors out there that they don't do what they teach. So therefore, like, I just spoke the other night in San Diego, and there was a guy there. I'll name him, and he's one of my heroes. Honestly, he's a guy that I read a lot of his stuff back in the early 2000s. His name was Ross Jeffries. Now he's older than me. Let's put it that way. But I was taking Q&A in the audience, and a guy said, well, what if somebody tells you they don't have money? And now I'm in front of, I don't know, 60, 70 people. And when you take Q&A live, you better have the answer. And I thought about it for a moment. I said, well, let me ask you this question first. Did he say that that you didn't create enough value and he wasn't willing to pay that? Or did he truly just not have any money? And he goes, the guy didn't have any money. And I'm like, well, and I was being kind. I'm like, that's on you, bro. I go, you should have known this before you got down the path of pursuing a sale where there was no money. You can't get money out of somebody or convince them to do something that they can't afford to do. And, I had to give an honest answer because that is the honest answer. And then this guy raises his hand. He goes, that's not how I would handle it. And he goes, well, what you would say is, if you can't afford it, then you can't afford not to do it. And I'm like, that was so freaking 1980s. It was just, I wanted to crawl off my chair and pound on this guy, but he was a hero of mine. And I'm like, okay, sideline reporter, active seller, right? Big difference. And there is a large difference than how we sold in the 90s versus today. There was a difference in the 2000s versus today.
So let's go there. And at the core of this is this idea that people do not decide their futures. They decide their habits. Mm-hmm. And their habits decide their future. So you look at the people, whether it's the people who are here live or the tens of thousands of people who will hear this on the podcast, what are some of the habits that we can form that if we formed them would make getting that sales edge and really understanding what our customers want easier or unnecessary?
Oh, great. I'm glad you asked this question. How ironic, and I don't know if Jeff said, I've been flying all day and my flights were delayed and we were in like crunch time, like to the minute. I logged in at exactly when this webinar started. So truth be told, I had to get here and shower and clean up, and literally every delay. Jeff, I didn't tell you this, but so I'm checking in while you're texting me, and they go, our key code, or the things they make the keys, stopped working in that moment. I'm like, oh my God. And I just said, look, I got to be honest with you. I've got this and this and this going on. And so they called the manager who let me in it was so tight. But Keystone, here's why I say this is when I buy books now, I buy them on Kindle. And what I love about Kindle, if you're a Kindle user, is in the old days, I used to carry 2 or 3 of the thick books that weigh 1 pound or 2 pounds, and I'd have a highlighter. And I got into the habit of when I would read and see something I really liked, I would highlight that. And that way, when I went back to, I'd say I wanted whatever was in the book, and then I just read my highlights. So I could read what took me 10 hours would take me 30 minutes if I just read my highlights. Kindle lets you do the same thing, but even better yet is that you can reread the book, or you can just go to a page that says my clippings, and all you read is what was most important to you. And ironically, you just said this, and I don't know that we were planning on this, but I reread The Power of Habit. So no coincidence there.
There you go.
So let's talk about, there's a number of habits as it relates to sales and hunting and winning business. And, and Jeff didn't cover this in my background, but I usually work with, most of my clients are large, well-known brands. Many of you've heard of all of them. And I'm working with their sellers that are responsible for running a territory. And part of that territory, part of their responsibilities is to go hunt and win business. So right now with 3 of my clients, I'm right in the middle of teaching the content on how to best do this. And it does boil down to a series of one things. And I'm not trying to contradict what Jeff's saying, but if you really boil down how to win major accounts, and if you saw my client list, and I don't know if it was in my bio or not, but I work with the T-Mobiles, the Panasonics, one of the largest accounting firms in the United States. I work with the heavy hitters that are hunting $1 million deals. And I said, look, let's just take all the million things you got to do in Salesforce.com, and let's boil it down to 3 set individual one things. And here's what it comes down to. If you're taking notes, now would be a good time to really write. Number 1 is you've got to be meticulous on identifying who your ideal buyers are. That's the very first step. Because the truth is, you can spend a lot of time being proactive, but if you're fishing in the wrong pond, or you're not catching the right kind of fish, then you're going to put a lot of work into little results. So for all of you, if you look at your client list of those people that buy from you right now, in every company I've gone to, I talk about what Jeff said, the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, which says that 80% of results come from 20% of your effort. And that's, that could be one of the foundational bases of the One Thing book. And if you're on this webinar, you've read the book, you've been exposed to the content, which is super rich. But if I examine a company's top clients compared to all their clients, and the total revenue, the profit they produce, whatever metric you want to give me, it is always, in some cases it's 10% produce 90%, or it's 20% produce 80%. And I said, okay, then as it relates to hunting and winning new business, which by the way is the most desired skill set of every company that I work with, that's why they bring me in, but it's always the lowest skill set, always. And when I look at this Pareto principle and I demonstrate this to them, I said, why aren't we spending all of our time hunting more of those 20% accounts? Oh, wow, that's a great idea. In theory, until you do it. So I started this program called Target Filtering. Okay, let's identify the common characteristics of your best accounts. It could be size, industry, geography, but if you look at their traits, you can start to see the threads and the patterns and say, okay, first step is we identify the ideal accounts. Within that is a second one thing. So you could identify that an account you want to go after is Coca-Cola or Nike, or maybe it's the bigger company that's in your city that you live in. Doesn't matter. Then it's saying, okay, in these deals, these accounts that we already have, who are the key players that were part of the decision-making process? And early in relations, people say, well, I deal with procurement. Okay, well, you're in the wrong spot, because anytime a bigger purchase is going to be considered, you're going to have people that will have influence on the decision, usually directors and VPs. And so I'll look at the common threads of, okay, now that we understand the company or the industry or the type of deal it is, who would be the usual suspects that would be involved? There's a financial person, there's usually a technology person, there might be an operations person, there might be HR. And then we identify the account and the people by title. And with LinkedIn, my gosh, I can type in director of operations, the one thing, VP of marketing, the one thing, and the person's probably going to show up. 92% of Americans have LinkedIn profiles. Or I can use, old school Hoovers and D&B. I could do a Google search. I can look on. It's not hard to find the names of the people who occupy the roles that could have a say in a decision, like whatever it is you sell.
So what I'm hearing you say, Jane, and I want to open this to you, the audience. How many of you, when you look at all things that you can do from a sales perspective, you are getting clarity on the 20% prospects, whether that be an account and within the account, the call point, the 20% prospects that will deliver 80% of your results. Before you pick up the phone, before you start running through walls, you are getting clarity on the 20%. How many of you are actually doing that? Put a yes or a no in the questions box right now. Okay. So here's what's this. For the people who the answer was no, this is awareness, baby. Clarity is power. How do we, Gene, what's the one thing that people are not doing that if they started doing immediately would make focusing on that 20% easier or unnecessary?
Recognizing how reactive you are to every opportunity that comes your way, and acknowledging how much time it takes for you to pursue every opportunity. Most of you have accounts you're dealing with now. You've got the work you've got to do to satisfy the clients that you have. We have limited amount of time to be proactive. And I find that most sellers are pursuing every opportunity that comes their way that's in their territory. And I said, just be conscious of how much time you're pursuing in, let's call it proactive behavior. And then if you really think about it, in most cases, it takes just as long to hunt a mid-size and a large-size deal as it does a small one.
So, go into that. Why?
Well, now, the truth be told, larger deals are going to have more people at the buyer's table. There's going to be more people to help make that decision. It's usually decision by committee. But you have to look at, you've got, let's just say if you're working for somebody, you've got 40, maybe 50 hours a week that you're going to dedicate based on what they pay you. So if you really start itemizing your time, like the one thing teaches time blocking, I find very few people have time blocks set up for pure proactive behavior. And that means you've got your list, you've got your people, you know what you've done in the past with them. I've emailed them, I've invited them to a webinar, I've placed a phone call, I tried to meet them at the conference, but you've tracked everything it is that you've done. So it's the first one thing out of the three is get very clear about who you want to hunt and who it may not make the most sense for you to hunt. Cool. And that's why, when I was at Gateway, just looking back, when I first sold, I could have one call with the grandmother in North Carolina, and the very next call could have been Ford Motor Company. And because we just worked, if somebody called in, we were going to sell them computers or do our best. Then we said, okay, we got to have a business division and a consumer division. So we got clear on we got to have our higher end people dealing with the bulk deals and the new people dealing with the one-by-one deals. Then we said, well, business is not just one thing. We have small business, we have mid-size, and we have enterprise. And then we had government. Well, government is state and local and federal. Then we had education. That's K through 12 and higher ed. So we kept refining the one thing as our business grew so we could put specialization towards a certain industry that would be buying computers. Then we expanded internationally, and you had international government, international business, international consumer. But the thing that I want to remind people of is the actual one thing can and will migrate, because you grow. And as you grow, you wouldn't be on this webinar if you weren't somebody that was an achiever. As you grow, the endeavors get big. For example,
it's success is sequential, not simultaneous. It's not just one thing. It's one thing at a time, right? Yeah. Every single thing could have its own one thing for the moment that you knock that domino down and they all fall. I heard you say, so targeting the right 20% is that
Yep.
first lead domino. What's the second one?
The second piece is then you've got to have a plethora of weapons that you launch. So this is about hunting big deals. So I use hunting vernacular, but you've got to launch weapons. Now, a weapon could be your phone calls, voicemails, the emails that you send, the emails that your marketing group sends. If you're in a company that has a marketing department, that could be the webinars you use. It could be the collateral you use. And you have to be able to delineate between content and collateral. Collateral is what it is you use while you're with the client. It's your spec sheets. It's the what your product does. Content, on the other hand, is educational information. Those are case studies, white papers, industry trending reports, clarification on confusion in the marketplace reports. So all of those weapons are needed for you to be effective at hunting mid-size and large-size deals. Social media is massive, but what by themselves, can move you in some cases down the road, but all of them combined is how you get the attention of the person you're trying to get to. That could be a connection on LinkedIn with an in-mail. And I'm not talking about spamming people. I'm talking about, hey, we both know Jeff Woods. Jeff, that you said you'd be a great person for me to reach out to. I've left you a couple voicemails. Could we get on a call so I can talk about how we might be able to help you? It's very simple stuff. It doesn't have to be magical or mysterious, but there isn't anybody by today's standards that you can't get to. There's really not. So the step two of the three in the one things is, okay, we've got to be adequate about launching an attack towards the ideal people within the ideal targets. And then step three of all of this is you've got to be prepared to execute the hunt. Inevitably, everything you're doing when you're launching weapons is designed for you to get a interaction with that person you're trying to get to. That could be on the phone or that could be face to face. But in executing the hunt, the predominant factor is you've got to be prepared to run highly effective initial meetings. That sets the pace and the tone for the rest of the relationship if there's going to be one. It sets the pace and the tone if your first meeting is going to move to the second, or if the first meeting helps you meet other people you need to meet, or bring your people in to meet their people. But if you don't run that first meeting, and that's what the edge of the sales edge of the book is all about, it's how to run the perfect first meeting. And that's chapter 7. Jeff mentioned, if you go to the salesedge.co, I'll send you a free chapter. I've been doing that to my subscribers. I'll give you a free chapter just because I promised that 4 months ago as I was getting towards the finish line of writing the book. But if you want to get that chapter, just go to that salesedge.co and I'll have my team send it out to you.
I want to talk about
how to run the perfect first meeting.
I want to talk about rapport a little bit, because I feel like when I think about what are the surprisingly simple truths behind extraordinary results, it all starts with that relationship, right?
It
And
does.
out of curiosity, how many of you who are on here live have ever heard that it's a good thing to build rapport before? If so, put yes in the questions box.
We should get 100% on that.
There's a point to this leading question. Okay, got that. Now let's ask the question that we asked earlier again. How many of you, when you build rapport, are doing it entrepreneurially? You're doing it just based on your natural abilities, the way that you think is best. And how many of you are doing it purposefully? You have a model and a system that you are following for building rapport. Put E or P in the questions box. Let's see what the answer is. Interesting. So Paige is the only one who has a P. So interesting. Surprisingly simple. A timeless truth. Build rapport. And Paige and now Sonia are the two that have a path, a purposeful path. Gene, what does that look like for you?
Here's my one thing answer is that if you want to be looked at as impressive, then be impressed with the other person. And by today's standards, and I still teach, there's 5 areas, use their name the same way they give it, look for areas of common ground, adjust your rate of speaking and your body language to theirs. I mean, that's some of the stuff that's been around for a long time, although it's still true. But here's the real key. Take 5 minutes and get on LinkedIn, get on Twitter, do a Google search on the person. I don't necessarily jump into the Facebook stuff because then you see personal, and the last thing you want to say is, I saw you were at the kids' soccer game. How'd that go? And you don't even know this person. They think you're a stalker at that point. But It's true. But on LinkedIn, I mean, look at what you get on LinkedIn. A, you see where they work. B, you see their career progression, where else they've worked. C, you're going to see if you have common contacts with that person. I see, I'm friends with Matt Millen, who used to work at T-Mobile as the VP of Sales. You remember Matt? If they're connected with Matt and they work at T-Mobile, the chances are pretty good. And then we start a conversation about something we have in common, and it's always best to start it on someone you have in common. But also you see where they went to college. And if you follow sports, you follow anything going on with colleges, and you know something that's happened, then you have so much great content of which to lead with. And one of the things that I have no problem saying is yeah, I was doing some research on you on LinkedIn, and I see that you were, played football at Michigan. My gosh, what was that like? Or I could even, when I say look for things to be impressed with by them, it's like anything, Jeff. You know that what you focus on, you tend to see more of. So I may find that they're active on Twitter, and Twitter is still very, very viable. And they are promoting a charity that they're attending or leading or speaking at or endorsing. I might do a little research on the charity. So the little work. Now, by the way, this is not like hours. This is 5 minutes at the stoplight as you're driving into the appointment, worst case scenario. I even have a function set up on LinkedIn so that when I have a meeting and it's in my Microsoft Outlook, LinkedIn actually emails me the pages of the people that have accepted the meeting. So that allows me to be even more lazy. I can just go to my email. Oh, that's right. I'm meeting with Jeff Woods, and I'm meeting with Matt Milling. I'm meeting with Jay Papasan, and click, 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 and I can get a snapshot of their bio and through LinkedIn. And I look for three things. What are three things that I commit to my memory so that when I get into the mix and meet the person and we sit down and I can say, Jeff, I was doing some research on you, and I see that you used to work in the pharmaceutical field for XYZ company. And I know somebody that worked there. Do you happen to know John Smith? Now, may or may not know the person, right? But it allows me to get into that position of being the person that is asking the questions. It leads into the most important part of that meeting is you being prepared to lead the conversation and ask questions. So I use rapport to lead right into, so let's talk about your business. Tell me what's going on.
Right.
So I migrate out of that, but because I'm the person making the statements and asking the questions, I now have what's called leverage within that conversation.
Yeah. It's something that became apparent to me while you were talking, Gene. Again, this is so simple, folks. Like the idea of doing 5 minutes of research. How many of you have heard or thought of, yeah, I can do 5 minutes of research before meeting with the person? It's probably all of us. Now, the question is, and this is the accountability moment, if we followed you around with a camera and documented your every single move, how many of you would your actions demonstrate that you are the type of person actually is curious enough about other people to set aside 5 little minutes to learn something about the people you're about to sit down with? I remember hearing Gary say the purpose of a goal is not to achieve a result, it's to be appropriate in the moment. It's about the person you become. How can you become the type of person who naturally just does a little bit of research? Sherry says she always does. Now, Sherry, let me ask you a question. How are your numbers? I'm willing to bet you're probably a pretty good performer, if that's the type of person that you are. Lynn says, I always do this for my doctor visits all the time. And Lynn, because I know you, I happen to know what your track record looks like. Surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. Folks, I want to open this up to you. What questions do you guys have for Gene as we go through this?
Yeah, Jeff, I'll add one more thing. It's like you look at our relationship. So we had common ground because we attended the same event. I just happened to get a really cool introduction from the event leader. You approached me and was talking about a podcast. Now, remember in those days, this is 3 years ago, I didn't know what a podcast was. I thought it was some weird internet thing, right? I'm a little bit older than most people. And
you still look great though.
But we built a little relationship, and then throughout our email conversation, Jeff made a comment about, well, why don't we have a cup of coffee? And in my mind, I'm like, I don't got time for coffee. I'm not driving to San Diego. It's an hour away. There's no way. And one of us said, where do you live? And it's like, oh my gosh, I live in the neighborhood right next to yours. And So we went from a meeting at a conference to interaction, which Jeff earned because he approached me and said, "Can I contact you?" We exchanged contact details. He followed up, which most people don't do. And I'm in the world. I'm in the game. Most people don't follow up when they say they will. I'm like, okay, it wasn't meant to be. We find out we have deeper common ground, that we live in the same area. We meet at a coffee shop right in the middle at it was a Starbucks, or it was the juice place, Nectar.
You love your
And
juice.
then he started talking to me about these webinar or podcasts. So I do a podcast, and it was within a month of that we had our next meeting, and he came in, his head's down, his shoulders are drooped. I didn't have to be a rocket scientist to read that body language. And then he told me about what happened with this company, and then I immediately went into, okay, so then let's figure out what you're going to do. You're either going to maximize the new comp plan, or you're going to vote with your feet and go somewhere else. And he decided to go somewhere else. And I just shifted his one thing from, oh my God, what am I going to do, to, oh my God, what do I want to do? And that started a whole series of new activities by Jeff. And that was, he started reaching out to people. He started calling and letting people know he was in the game and was looking for some new opportunity, wanted to be in this self-development world. He had started getting great traction from his free podcast. He had no upsell, no cross-sell. And so we did two things simultaneously. One was, Jeff, you're here, so you can tell me if I'm BSing anybody. One was, I said, I think he had like 8,000 or 10,000 downloads a month at that time, which was a ton. I mean, by today's standards, it's okay, but in those days, I'm like, holy cow. So we figured out a back-end program of group coaching. Remember that, Jeff?
The continuity thing.
The continuity for the mentee.
Yep.
So, because you had to figure out a way to pay your bills.
Yep.
And simultaneously, he was hunting and searching, and then boom, this was before the one thing. This was just Gary Keller and Jay. And then we made an absolute one thing priority focus to say, let's make sure you're prepared for every interview, what you're going to do when you fly down there, what you're going to do on the phone calls. And I'm not taking any credit for that, but it's a perfect example of what we read in the book. It's getting laser beam focused on priority objectives, getting out of what happened in the past and moving towards what it is you want.
Let's talk about the mindset behind that a little bit, Gene, because I think that matters. I mean, you've spent time with some of the self-development greats.
Well, predominantly it is, the past is what happened, and the only time you really fail is when you fail to get the lesson. And for those of you that get my book and read it, you're going to see I outline in detail some of my biggest failures. But out of every failure that I've had, there's been a very distinct lesson that I got that then those stories I use now when I teach live at conferences and seminars. But the past is something you learn from, but if you live there, especially as most human brain patterns are, as to the things you screwed up, the things that didn't go right, somebody may have wronged you and now you hate everybody that's like them, like women that go, I hate all men are terrible. Well, maybe it was one or two circumstances, but it doesn't mean everybody's bad, right? But all of them have this uncanny ability to look to the future, be clear on what it is they want to do, be okay if they try something and it doesn't work, because usually by the time they get there, they assess it. If it works, you very rarely hear about all the failures people have. The good ones will be very clear about their failures, but you only see, the person that's on stage or the person that's on the football field. You don't see the sacrifices, the misses, the things that didn't go right, the negative people in their life. And believe me, everybody's got that stuff. But the great ones have ability to put that behind them. Jeff said, you become like the 5 people you hang out with the most. It's true.
Yeah.
And if you're around people that are pulling you down, consciously or unconsciously, it impacts you. And if you are around people that are supporting you, that are doing things that you want to do, and you get to see their habits and their patterns, then it rubs off on you too.
Yeah. Chris asked a question because he was talking more about the model and the system behind this. And I'll explain what the EDGE acronym stands for. And Gene, you can dive a little bit deeper. But Sales EDGE, EDGE, stands for, first EDGE is educate, which Gene already mentioned. Are you the type of person who is doing a little bit of due diligence beforehand on your clients, so that when you walk in, you can build reports? The one thing you can do, such that by knocking that 2-inch domino down, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary when it comes to building that rapport. The D is define the gap. And Gene will go into what that means. G is greater gap, and E is emotional connection. So Gene, what does it mean to actually define the gap and then create a greater gap?
Well, when I was out in the field selling, I struggled at first. So I went from the inside selling over the phone, which I ended up doing very well and had 8 years of doing that. And then we started having field position. And I thought that selling face to face to big companies was going to be just like selling to them over the phone. Found out it was quite the opposite. So as I was at another time in my career that I was at the bottom of the ladder in terms of performance, I went to my instincts was I got to go find, that author, that speaker, that person that has done what it is I want to do. And I was turned on to a book called Spin Selling by a guy named Neil Rackham. And this is 1997. This is one of the best sales books at that time. And he talked about the SPIN acronym, which was understand the situation, develop the problem, understand the implications of that problem. In other words, what other problems is this core problem causing? And then create what's called a need payoff scenario. If I'm able to solve this problem, would you be willing to do work with me or sign the PO or introduce me to other people? And that worked really, really well. Now keep in mind, I was selling computers, and by end of 99, 2000, just about everybody had computers. Certainly businesses did. And the companies I was going after, they put me in a best buyer scenario that I described earlier without telling me what it was. They just said, you can only call on these 16 accounts that do not do business with us. And in Kansas City, that was Sprint and Hallmark Cards. Think of some of the big brands that you recognize right now. They're headquartered in Kansas City. But as I would, through just pure discipline and determination and making the calls, I'd get the meetings and I'd say, so what kind of problems are you experiencing? Well, we really don't have any major problems. Everything seems to be going good. The computers are working. Everybody's got a computer. We work with one of my competitors now. And I'm like, are you sure you don't have any problems? Nothing you can, no, we really don't have that much. And I'd say, I had nowhere to go with that. So I'd say, okay, well, I'll come back in 90 days in case your business needs change. Here's my number, which they never called. I realized there had to be a better way. And then I discovered one time I was working with a large bank, United Missouri Bank. And as I was in there, they loved having me come in because I always brought like donuts and sandwiches. So they would take the meeting. I just wouldn't get anywhere with them. Hindsight's 2020, right? But one of the things I noticed is that I was down with the technicians, the computer guys, and they're like, we got to cancel our meeting today because a load of computers are coming in. I'm like, well, where are you sending the computers? Well, we got 2 new branches opening. I'm like, why do they come to you and not the branch? Like they were opening a bank in, somewhere in Missouri or Kansas. And they said, well, we got to install all of our software and make sure it works, our bank software, and then we got to test it, and we got to rebox, and we got to reship them. And I said, can I watch this process? So I watched all their technicians come in and take this load of 40 computers. If you ever unboxed a great big computer, you got to take it off, take the styrofoam off. They would plug the computer in, turn it on, load their software, run their diagnostics, test the software to make sure it worked, then rebox the computer and put it back on a UPS truck. And I timed it out, and it took about an hour and 20 minutes per machine, per technician to do this work. And I just said, now keep in mind, they didn't perceive they had a problem because they were doing things the way they had always been taught to do them. And I said, well, let me ask you this. What if, our company, Gateway at that time, we didn't have computers on the shelf that we would give to somebody. When the order was placed, we would then build the computer based on how they wanted it built and send it out. I said, what if I was able to save you this hour and 20 minutes and install the software when we built the computer and ship the computers directly from our warehouse, from our manufacturing plant in South Dakota directly to the banks? And they're like, you can do that? I'm like, yeah, we do it all the time. So I said, just give me a test. I said, burn a hard drive. We'll sign a non-disclosure. They put their software on a hard drive. I hand drove it for 4 hours up to Sioux City in North Sioux City, South Dakota. And my buddies worked in that custom department, and I said, this one's got to be right. So we did the 10. They worked, but we shipped the 10 to the headquarters. So their technicians who were, not believing that we could do what I said we would do, they believed it. And then I got an order for 50. Then I got an order for 100. And they were opening branches like crazy. This is, 99, 2000. And then finally, the senior person said, we're going to do a complete technology refresh. So anybody who hadn't gotten new computers in the previous year, they were just going to clear every computer out. There was over 4,000 on their total network and get brand new ones. And now I was starting to pick up steam and take little bits and pieces of orders away from my competitor Compaq. But I did something that I didn't do it on purpose. This was instinct, but I look back on it, it was pretty smart. I said, who's writing the RFP, the request for proposal? I said, can I meet this person? Because I said, wouldn't it make sense that you required all the vendors who were competing for this to load the software on the hard drive and ship them directly to the end user like we've been doing with Success? And like, that's a great idea. Let's get Bob in here. So they tell the guy, the director or the VP at the time, told Bob that all software needs to be pre-installed, yada, yada, yada. In essence, what I did during that moment is I completely locked out my competitors, because my competitors couldn't do this in manufacturing. They'd have to ship it to a value-added reseller who would then install the software at a cost. So we still had great profit margins. I priced out my competitors, and we ended up winning at that time the biggest deal in the history of the company as it related to corporate sales. So that was the case.
What I'm hearing you say, Gene, is that because you had observed their process, you observed a problem they didn't know they had.
That's right.
You defined a gap. You're having to spend an hour and 20 minutes and all this stuff, and it doesn't have to happen. And what does it mean to actually make that gap greater? And I'll preface by saying we've got about 1 minute before we got to wrap.
Okay, so the greater gap is simply this. Help them think about the future 6 to 12 months down the road as if A, the problem continues or gets worse. So what's going to happen over the next 12 months when these 4,000 units have to come to headquarters and your technicians are all going to be bogged down installing software? What is that really going to mean? How are you even going to do it based on the timeline the VP gave? And they're just like, oh, I have no idea. And then suddenly you can just see that this seemingly little problem get really large. Secondly, I said, imagine what it's going to be like where all of your technicians, because what happened to technicians when they would go install the software, all their work orders, you remember back in the day when the tech would have to come out because Freddie's printer doesn't work or the escape key on the keyboard doesn't work, right? When technicians were heavily used. But when they would go install the software, their work orders would log and get bigger, and then they would be in fire drills. They'd have to spend money on overtime. So the greater gap is simply, it's an NLP technique. Help them look into the future, not as if they're going to make the decision, but what is going to happen if they do or don't in 6 to 12 months. Get them into an imagination frame. And the final E of the EDGE process is what's called an emotional connection. If you really study the sages, they talk about the importance and power of storytelling. Why? Because we've all learned since we were kids from stories, from grandpa, from reading books. Our kids today have no shortage of Disney movies or Pixar movies, but we learn from stories at an early age. We're neurally conditioned to learn more from stories than we do a textbook. So you've got to be able to eloquently and effectively communicate stories of your existing clients that were similar to them, that had a similar problem. And now, since working with you, that problem has gone away or their life or business has gotten better. So that's the edge.
So what
Understand,
I'm hearing,
develop a gap, because if there's no gap, there's no sale. Take them to the future, help solidify it with a story. And by telling a good story, you indirectly pitch what you do without pitching what you do.
yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, and I think that's the key there. So if I'm walking away and I'm just thinking about following models and systems, how do I become the type of person who naturally educates myself on my client? 5 minutes of research. How am I the type of person who naturally develops a gap? I see a problem and educate them on how I can solve it. I'm the type of person who makes that gap greater by asking them questions, not telling them, asking them questions of what's the consequence if they do or do not take action, and ultimately create the emotional connection by being the type of person who can weave in powerful storytelling.
Spot on. Spot on. I mean, Jeff, and I see in your one thing emails and these webinars I get on where you'll have somebody come on and say, I employed the one thing, I was struggling, and I had too many things to do and not enough time to do it. Now I get everything done. I've got so much peace. I'm more productive. Those are critical and important stories as long as they're real. And I know they are in your case because I know you. But there's a significant believability factor that a lot of people violate, that they exaggerate their stories, or they tell a story that's not true. And my caution to everybody is just take the time to do the research from your best clients and understand what's gotten better in their life or business because of their interaction with you. Once you understand that, that's the basis of the story. What
Yeah.
was their problem? What did you solve? Or what were they doing and what did you make better? United Missouri Bank did not believe they
You
had a
know what, Gene,
problem.
I'm
That's
actually
where
going to
they
have
were
to cut it
spinning
off because
wheels.
we're 1 minute past, and I want to be
Okay.
respectful of people's time. Best of luck on the book launch. People who are interested,
Thank you.
on the 16th, the Sales Edge will go live. You can pick it up on Amazon or at thesalesedge.co. And Gene, just again, I really appreciate you. And to all of you, thank you so much. If you're not yet subscribed to the One Thing podcast, please do so. That's where all the future content is going to be coming out. So we appreciate all you guys and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.